There's been a lot of crowing, on these anniversaries. You see this in the Western press, that war has been a total disaster for Russia. Russia went in, with supreme confidence. They were going to take Kiev in 3 days. You often hear that. They were planning to take all of Ukraine. It was part of an effort to reestablish the Soviet Union. And it's, but now they find themselves, they've only taken, a small part of it. The lines are, the line of conflict is barely moving. It's essentially a stalemate. They're suffering horrific losses, and their economy is on a wartime footing, and it just cannot sustain this much longer. It's on the verge of collapse. This is the kind of talk that we hear again and again. And then also it's just that, again, we thought that the Russians were very competent, but now we realize that this is a third-rate army that's, maybe you hear a little bit less of that now, but this is what you hear, right? So I'd like to just pick it apart. Maybe just starting off with the intentions. This notion that Russia was, intended to take Kiev in 3 days and all of Ukraine. Where does it come from? It does not come from the Russians. You can't find any statement, from Putin or Lavrov or anything. There was never that. So this is something that they've simply put in his head. They've created a straw man, but it's said again and again. It's like it's almost a known fact that we're planning to take it in 3 days. You say, no, where did that come from? So, this is an old technique. You inflate these expectations for the other side. You create goals that they never had. They failed to meet those goals, and then you say, look at those incompetence. So I think that, first of all, that's something that we have to set aside. Now, also, it's interesting that, that you do have, you have this claim again that the Russians, fell far short of their objectives, and there's a lot of ridicule about it. But if you look back at actually a lot of the things that the Westerners were saying, let's say the Western press, but also generals like General Hodges of Great Britain, another Anders Asland is another. Julian Ripke. Julian Ripke is actually one of the more realistic, or really has proved himself to be honest at this point. I think he's really woken up to the reality of this war. But in the early months of the war, he was tweeting out there with a lot of these other guys, like the names that I mentioned and many others, that the Russians are this war is going to be over in 3 weeks or 3 months or something like that. You heard that a lot in 2022 and 2023. So let's not think, maybe there were people, of course, on the Russian side that had those kind of expectations. It was not the government. It was not Putin. It was whatever. But let's be honest that there was this expectation on many people on the Western side that it was going to be an easy war. It wasn't. Well, what happened? What actually were the Russians about? Were they really trying to take Kiev? Were they really trying to take all of Ukraine? Again, we have the statements that Putin made. It was about denazification. It was about demilitarization. It was about neutrality, about keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And these are things that he said consistently before the war and after the war, and there's no reason to doubt that that's what it was about. And I think more than that, we can see that that's what it was about, because immediately after the war began, negotiations began. And we had, the Istanbul Agreement, the draft of the Istanbul Agreement was reached. And when you look at it, there's actually nothing about territory in there. This was never a territorial grab. The Russians were going to, according to the agreement, they were going to withdraw from all these territories that they took with the launch of the SMO. And all in Kharkov and Zaporozhye, and actually there are quite a few Russian nationalists were not happy about that. They say, look, we already have these. Why are you going to give them up? But it showed, again, you could see they even had it on paper. This is what they had negotiated. This is not about territory. It's about those other things that we just mentioned. That's what it's about. And you would just never know that from listening to the Western press. So anyway, you say, well, what did happen? In the early days, I think another important thing, again, if the Russians had this kind of outsized territorial ambition, they would have gone in with 1 million men, at least. I mean, to take a territory of that size, you have to have at least 1 million men to do that. That's probably not even sufficient. I mean, you probably need a 2 million man army to do that. They went in with 150,000, 100,000 Russian Federation soldiers and then about 50,000 from the Donbass. That's really a tiny army. And it's an army, again, that was really, it was no larger at the beginning than what the Ukrainians had. And very quickly, the Ukrainians mobilized, and they had a much larger army than the Russians. So let's go to this question of competence. Say, they've proven themselves. Well, yeah, Russia's a much larger country, but they put in a small army. And the army was actually outnumbered by this other army that was NATO trained and it was being NATO armed and whatever. And in spite of that, they took a lot of territory very quickly. Now, I think there's no question that there was some incompetence and there were intelligence failures. If you look at the South, actually their success was near total. Very quickly they took a good chunk of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and then the area around Mariupol, and then Mariupol itself. In fairly early in 2022. And that happened in many of these places, because they had apparently, had worked something out ahead of time with like mayors and so forth who were pro-Russian. Because again, these are regions that are, that largely lean towards Russia, that are almost entirely Russian speaking. And so a lot of these mayors and military commanders, essentially said, come on in. And that's what happened. Now, there was a place, I think in the case of Kharkov, they thought they had a similar arrangement, but the Ukrainian intelligence had caught wind of it and set a trap for them. And so I believe it was the mayor of Kharkov city, said, come on in, but actually they laid a trap and they were ambushed and the Russians suffered heavy losses and they didn't take Kharkov city, as we well know. So, there were failures. But you just have to look at the nature of it. Again, this is described as a full-scale invasion again and again. It's just repeated. It's just sort of ridiculous. But how is it a full-scale invasion? It was not. It just wasn't. We're talking about 150,000. And then, so anyway, in the very early stages of the war, we saw what happened. That's, this was a very different kind. This was a special military operation. It was not a full-scale invasion. It just wasn't. But then we enter into kind of a strange period, where it seems like the Russians really didn't know what to do. They had these territories, but they had a very, very small army, and they really didn't have the sufficient numbers to hold them. And the Ukrainian army was, increasing rapidly in size and was greatly outnumbered them. And the attempts at negotiations had failed. So we had that period in the summer where they were just holding on, making some advances in certain places. But they hadn't done anything to deal with the new reality, because it was now a new reality. Now Ukraine had this much larger army, and negotiations, were over. The Russians kept on trying to contact the other side. The Ukrainians just wouldn't respond. But they just seemed like there was sort of a paralysis, which, you have to say that was a mistake on the part of the Russians. They should have reacted more quickly. So we had that offensive in the north in Kharkov that took the Russians, which is very lightly defended by the Russians. It took them by surprise. Now, the Russians did do a good job of getting out of there quickly, but they had to withdraw from a lot of territory. And then later in Kherson, they made the decision, okay, we have to draw back to the other side of the river. They were actually doing a good job of defending against Ukrainian attacks there in Kherson region. But there was those troops were at risk because all logistics had to go over the Dnieper. And if you remember, the Ukrainians were taking out the bridges with the HIMARS. When the HIMARS were first introduced, they were pretty effective. We can get into that later. But so they had to withdraw. They just weren't ready for this. This became a new war. And so it wasn't until the fall of 2022 that the mobilization began, and the Russians now geared for what was going to be a real war. They understood that this was the new reality and this is what we're going to fight. So I think it's one thing, it's very, very important. We talk about this 4 years of war, but it's sort of like they're very distinct phases. And so when people say, well, it's been 4 years and the Russians have only done this, well, it's not really what happened. Again, it was something. It was a special military operation with these very limited, well-defined objectives not to take territory in the first months, in 2022. And then it became, they just went on defense. Remember, we had the Surovikin lines. They constructed these defensive lines in the south. Usually, in most cases, 3. In some places, there were maybe even 5 or 6. Because they knew, okay, they had to go on to defense now to prepare because for the next phase of war. So then in 2023, we had the summer offensive. That was soundly defeated by the Russians. And then we entered, but you could say, okay, then they began, or the next phase, the real war, I think you could say in the fall of 2023, with the attack, the siege, and then the storming of, and of Avdeevka.
Avdeevka, Bakhmut.
Avdeevka, yeah, no, it's just all of a sudden, yeah, Avdeevka. Yeah, I'm so sorry because it's those. Anyway, yeah, Avdeevka, that was critical, and that was a change. Okay, but it wasn't a general offensive. But if I would say that really the war that we're seeing now began not 4 years ago, but 2 years ago. And you can see it was when Avdeevka fell in February of 2024, 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago from day. And after that, you saw the Russians, begin to move out, spread out, and create a broader front. And we've gone from then. And this shows up in the statistics. There was a real change in the nature of the war at that point. You can see it, first of all, in just the amount of territory that was taken. It was, before it was very minimal, but then it began to, accelerate, and to the point, it's accelerating gradually, let's be honest, it's not as rapid, but it has increased, not always month after month, but certainly year on year, or, the broad trend is clear, that the Russians ever since then have been taking more and more territory. Another thing that you can see is reflected in the body exchanges. You have, starting around that time, not, fairly shortly after the fall of Avdeevka. Before then, these body exchanges were, they were in general in favor of the Russians, but not by a huge margin. And the numbers were pretty low overall. But it began the ratio, of like Ukrainian bodies to Russian bodies began to increase rapidly. So they get to the point where we are today. If you look over the past year, the ratio is 39-1. And we're talking about many, many, many thousands. So you're going from like 4-1 to 30. And that began after Avdeevka. You see, this is a whole new war that we've entered in. So when they talk about 4 years of war, they've only done this. It's really, the war that we're looking at now is really 2 years old, I would say. And, that's still a significant amount of time. I think it has to be admitted by everybody, both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, that nobody really foresaw that this would last so long. No matter how you break it apart. But why is that? Is that because of the incompetence of the Russian army? No, I just say it's new technology. We're in a whole new world. Nobody knew what this war was going to be like. But now we're finding out what war in the 21st century between peer adversaries or peer and near peer adversaries is like. It's similar again to World War I. A lot of people thought that this is going to be over in a month. And they went in, and of course, it went on for 4 years, and many, many tens of millions died. Why? Was it because the Brits were incompetent, or the French were incompetent, or the Germans were incompetent? No, none of that. It was new technology. It was really the machine gun above all that changed everything, So it was a whole new kind of war. And it's drones more than anything that's just changed everything. Drones and surveillance and satellites has changed everything now and has made this the war that it is. So anyway, what are we looking at now? If we understand that it's like, okay, this is really a 2-year war that we're looking at. Well, first of all, is the point that's been made many times has to be understood. It's a war of attrition. So yeah, territorial gains matter, but that's not the main point of what's happening. It's like Clausewitz, the military theorist, said, it's just like you win a war by destroying the other side's ability to make war. And it seems clear that's what the Russians are doing. Now, the Ukrainians have had a lot of ability to make war because they've been constantly supplied, by the West. So we had, they began with a lot of Soviet-era weapons, and some of those were very good, especially their air defense. But now that's, pretty much all gone. And then, so they get NATO weapons. So they've gone through, you could say, several armies. If it was just Russia versus Ukraine, this would have been over, a while ago. But it's not Russia versus Ukraine. It's a war of attrition. And this war of attrition, the soldiers are Ukrainians, but the weapons are not their own. The vast majority are not. They're constantly resupplied, and they're fed and whatever with Western funds. But even in spite of that, you can just see that it's not just that the Ukrainians are being worn down, but all of NATO is being worn down. Now, if we look at just, so again, so much of the analysis is just based on what you see on the maps. And if you just look at what's happening on the maps, the territory that the Russians are taking, I think it's fair to still say it's gradual, it's incremental. It is increasing, and it's been increasing since Avdeevka. But it's still pretty slow. Let's just be honest about it. Just looking, spent some time looking at a map and pulled out a ruler and, measured distances, different cities, and looked at, past advances, or how much territory was taken in last year. And say, if things continued at the current pace, say no more acceleration, it just continues. The Russians continue to advance at the pace that they've advanced, let's say, over the course on the average in 2025. It's going to be another. Let me first say it this way. If you hear, these Western analysts will say, well, at the current rate, it's going to be 100 years. I remember hearing that like a year and a half ago. And looking at it, based on the statistics that they were working with, that was pretty accurate. But there are some problems with it. First, we're talking about different phases of the war. I think we need to, instead of talking about a 4-year war, we need to talk about a 2-year war. And then second, often they're using these Ukrainian maps that are bogus. They're always like several months behind. And you hear that still, among a lot of Western analysts. According to them, apparently Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and Guliopole, these places are still in play. They're not, all those places fell months ago. So anyway, they're working with slightly funny statistics to end up with a 100-year war. But if you looked at really accurate statistics, it would still have been like a 50-year war looking at it, a year or so ago. And that's really slow, right? Now, they're going somewhat faster. But the thing is, they're talking about assuming that Russia is trying to take all of Ukraine. And it's not. Again, the declared objectives are the 4 oblasts. And if you just look at that, according to my calculations, very, very rough, just estimates, don't even call them calculations. It's going to be another 2 years before they take all 4 oblasts. In Zaporozhye, they have to take the city of Zaporozhye. Now that may, even though it's a very large city, I believe it's 700,000, it may fall fairly quickly because it's on low ground. The Russians will be approaching from higher ground. And then, of course, it's got its back to the river. And so that makes it's like it's already half under siege by that. They don't need to encircle it. It's already, in a semicircle in a sense already because of the river. And they can cut off logistical supplies easily. There's just a couple of bridges. Zaporozhye, even though it's quite large, may not be that hard to take, but it's still quite large. And then there's actually the Zaporozhye region extends to the other side of the river. So they're going to have to cross the river and take that. And then Kherson, everything, they're going to have to cross the river. That's going to be tough. And Lugansk is taken. But Donetsk, okay, they still have some major cities, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And they're marching towards those. They're already kind of in the southern extension of it, which is Konstantinovka. That's kind of part of the larger conurbation, they call it. So I think there's, even well, it definitely, like all these cities will be under siege, I would expect under the end of the year, but they may not fall until, sometime even close to 2 years from now. It's just, if you look at the current rate, there's a chance of that. I mean, a very reasonable chance. But that's that's based on certain assumptions. That's just looking at the map and saying that it's going to continue as it is, that it's not going to continue to accelerate and maybe accelerate more quickly, that there won't be a military collapse. And then another thing is that that's just focusing on the map. I think if we draw back and we look at the larger picture, we actually see something very different. There's one thing, where the Russians have not accelerated slowly, and that is the air war. That there has been rapid acceleration in the air war over the course of the last year, and we know where we are, and it has brought Ukraine very nearly to its knees. Its energy infrastructure has been severely and permanently damaged. And it's, and that has affected logistics, and the logistics lines, trains and train stations also have been directly attacked. And the Russians increasingly have control, long-range drones that are striking deep in the rear and hitting, again, mainly logistical targets. So that is an area where the Russians, again, are accelerating rapidly. And then another aspect to this conflict is economics. Any war effort always relies on, economic, the economic foundation. You can't have, you can't feed soldiers and make bullets and weapons and so on, without production facilities. And now that's been pretty much wiped out within Ukraine. There are underground workshops that are turning out drones, and that's making a big difference, right, in the war. But by and large, it's been wiped out, and they're just utterly dependent on what they get from Europe and the U.S. So that if you look at that part of the conflict again, it just looks very, very grim for the Ukrainians. We're talking about all those predictions, that were made of quick, easy Ukrainian victory on the battlefield. And then we heard many, many more, especially with reference to the summer 2023 offensive, those all were false. But there were also all kinds of predictions, again, even by the President of the United States, that the Russian economy was going to collapse quickly. They were very confident. And instead, we've seen Russia actually perform better than all of Europe has, during these 4 years. But most importantly, with reference to the war, is that they have ramped up their military production to the point where they're outproducing, and this is admitted by even Mark Rutte and generals and whatever, they're outproducing all of NATO in so many important munitions. So, and then the Russians continue to ramp that up. And then on the other side, there's talk, but it's amazing. Because again, I remember I'm surprised by this too. Again, that at the beginning of the war, I said, well, geez, NATO has 25 times the GDP. If the Russians don't win quickly, they're certainly going to get their engines revved up and they're just going to swamp Russia. But we found the reverse to happen. And, it just seems like, again, the willingness of the people in Europe and in the U.S. to support this war, to continue to send billions, is waning. It's just really, the popular support is not there, and the funds are not there, especially in Europe. That's another aspect. Again, you can't just look at the map. You got to look at the larger reality, and there does appear to be, a profound economic crisis on the very near horizon now for Ukraine. So this 2 years that I was talking about, that's just not considering all of that. But those things, again, the effects of the air war, and these are very much, interlinked. Again, like the damage that is done by Russian missiles obviously affects the Ukrainian economy, greatly damages the Ukrainian economy, increases the need for more funds which aren't there. And so you can see just a vicious circle there. And again, it's hard to predict, when it hit, but it quite possibly will hit Ukraine in very substantial form sometime this year. And we could see, instead of the 2 years to get the oblast, that may accelerate quite rapidly. And again, not just because of what's happening at the line of conflict, but what's happening in the rear and in the economy.
Do you think that the only way that this war truly ends is if Ukraine's backers, the Western countries, Western European countries, the United States, admit that this war is over and want to normalize relations with Russia? I mean, if they don't, then we'll always have some type of covert war going on through, through Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a danger. It really is. And unfortunately, we just don't see any signs that the Western leadership, let's talk about the Europeans in particular. They still seem to be entirely obsessed with this war and unable to kind of escape the mental trap that they've fallen into. I just don't see any signs of it. And unfortunately, like those lone dissident voices like Orban in Hungary, well, at least Orban's voice itself may be eliminated. That was part of, the hope would be that he would be spearheading a growing dissent throughout Europe. We do have Fico in Slovakia, and then Babic, who's, maybe not quite so explicit in his opposition to the war, but does kind of, he sits on the fence and maybe leans a little bit in in favor of negotiations with the Russians. There was a hope that would spread. But now it looks like we may lose Orban. I mean, the most recent polls show that he's like 12 percentage points behind. And the person who'll come in who may replace him is going to be very, very cozy with the EU. And that just means that he's going to be, in favor of supporting Ukraine. So it seems like, I hope I'm proven wrong. There always could be a failure in Hungary, but a success somewhere else. But at the moment, you just don't see much reason to hope for any real change in policy direction within Europe. And then, of course, America's its own thing.
So if the EU continues to back Ukraine fully, then does that mean that when the only way really to defeat Ukraine is when all these European countries essentially fall economically? You said that in Clausewitz, they said to destroy your enemy's ability to make war. And what we're seeing is we're destroying not only Ukraine's ability to make war, but NATO in general. And then you talked about this economic crisis, this fiscal cliff that's coming for the Ukrainians, and who are the backers, the Europeans, if they're fully in. So are you saying that they will go down with the ship as well? All of their economic might, their military might is collapsing in this black hole that is Ukraine?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are many things that are causing the economic crisis in Europe, and it's not just Ukraine, but it's part of it. All the money that they have to send to Ukraine directly.
The energy costs.
Right. Yeah, that's, again, the energy costs, the destruction of their own pipelines, and their just suicidal decisions to cut themselves off from cheap, reliable Russian energy. That obviously has greatly contributed to the economic crisis there. Yeah, I don't know that again, these kind of things, some countries can kind of, not Russia, but rather Europe is still a prosperous place overall. I mean, they have made many stupid decisions. They're less prosperous than they would otherwise be. They have, to a great extent, mortgaged their future. But it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to see a collapse. It's just, but what we may see, for all of Europe, maybe I'm not ready to make that prediction. But what we are coming up to is maybe a collapse in support for Ukraine directly. Again, we saw how hard they tried to get that 140 billion euro loan together. It failed. It was shot down by members of the EU because it was frankly illegal the way they were going to do it. So they ended up with this 90 billion euro loan. And they're even having trouble with that. Well, one thing is Hungary is holding it up, but I think there are other barriers. And that's just clearly not going to be sufficient. It's just, it's a stopgap measure. And the willingness, of their own people to support these measures is evaporating, is diminishing by the day. As their own economic problems become worse, people, the voters in Europe become less and less patient with sending billions to Ukraine. So it's just maybe, I don't know, I think, maybe eventually there will be an overall severe economic crisis in Europe. There could be an economic collapse, maybe, I just don't. But what is clear is that we are facing, a real fiscal cliff vis-a-vis Ukraine.
So we're kind of saying possibly the only hope for Europe is if they vote out the bombs in time. But then you have this problem where the EU is this bureaucratic behemoth that doesn't respect the wishes of the people, that people don't vote for these leaders. Right. So it doesn't sound hopeful, and we've just seen how things work in all of our democracies. It's just the illusion of democracy.
Yeah.
We vote for these things and then immediately we get more war and we get nothing that aren't operating in the interest of us. It's a democracy for lobbies, whatever lobby pays the most, they get their way. So it sounds like,
right.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is it almost sounds like that this war will end when the EU and NATO fall apart. And
yeah, well, it could end before then. I mean, it's just like, okay, again, Russia has announced that they're going to take those 4 oblasts, and I'm sure they're going to do that. I'm very confident that they will anyway. But if the support for Ukraine continues, and there's no willingness to negotiate on the other side, to promise neutrality or anything else. I think that the incentive, really the need for Russia to continue and to take at least Nikolaev and Odessa is going to be there, and they're probably going to take those, and probably Kharkov as well. And it could be more than that. I don't know. It's just because the Russians really would. I think it's obvious that Putin really wants to negotiate something, and that he would be willing to just stay with these 4 oblasts and even to allow Ukraine to keep Odessa, even though it is very much a Russian city, founded by Catherine the Great. But he would be willing to do that. But if they do not, the other side has to negotiate, they have to accept the terms. And if they don't, and he gets there and they still don't, then the only way to protect Russia, because this is really what it's about. It's about, creating a buffer between Russia and an aggressive West. This is the history that they're very well aware of. They will need, I think that the logic in favor of taking Odessa is going to be overwhelming. Say, okay, if we can't negotiate anything, we're just going to have to take Odessa to deny their access to the Black Sea. And I think that's what it will be. But even then, it's going to be like Mearsheimer says, and I think he's quite right. Yeah, the Russians are going to win, in one form or another. But it's going to be an ugly victory because the other side just shows no willingness to really negotiate, to achieve a lasting peace. So the Russians are just going to go as far enough where they say, okay, we've taken the land that really makes us safer, protects the Black Sea and, protects our western borders. And, when they get to that point and say, unfortunately, you'll have to say they failed in one respect, and that was the denazification, of which is, I think maybe you could say the debanderization would be the more accurate thing, but it's kind of we're splitting hairs there, because they could end up with a very, a Banderite government that's armed to its teeth, Again, you say, well, to some extent demilitarized because they just have so little. They will have, even if they get a lot of arms from the West, they don't have access to the Black Sea. They're far from the Donbass. They present less of a threat. So in terms of demilitarization, it would at least they would be partially successful.
Yeah, I just feel like looking at Western leaders and how this has been playing out, that this will only end when the EU and NATO truly just fall apart, disintegrate. Because I mean, these leaders, they can't handle the sunk cost fallacy. If people come back like, oh, we talked about when Boris Johnson blew up the deal right after the SMO started. They could have had all four oblasts could still have been part of Ukraine. Right. That whole thing. Okay. That's gone. And now they had this deal, just 4 oblasts. And then they're going to lose Odessa, lose Kharkov. And I think the way things are going, they're going to lose Kiev. But every single time they take one of those cities, it'll be like, now we have to triple down, quadruple down. Because this is so bad. If we lose Odessa, then like, oh my goodness. If we lose Kharkov, we lose Kiev. Oh no. So they have no choice but to continually double down. And then even when, let's say Russia gets to a place like Kiev or whatever, we know that these intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, they're so heavily involved here that they will keep going. This is a government machine that will continue until it completely drains the West, until we have run out of capability, militarily, and we are just bankrupt. The dollar is no longer the reserve currency. It's hyperinflating. The EU is falling apart. There's infighting amongst everybody, and the whole thing breaks apart. NATO's gone. The EU's gone. I feel like that's the only way that this ends. I don't see any other way, unless, like we said, that somehow all these people that are in this bureaucratic machine that's called the EU just have a change of heart. Or all these leaders, and we just don't see that happening. Like you said, you thought that Orban could be the one to spearhead some change in Europe. Looks like actually he gets edged out, and then we have more conformity, more lockstep until we die, on this hill. That's what they're deciding. We will die on this hill, hoisted by our own petard. I don't know if I used that right, but I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's kind of, again, it's sort of similar to I did draw a parallel between what's happening in Ukraine to what's happening in the Arabian Sea, and it is similar. And actually, again, the two events are not, you can't entirely separate them. Again, as Mark Svoboda pointed out, that a major war between Iran and the U.S. is going to further deplete the already depleted American stockpiles, and it's going to make further weaken the war effort in Ukraine. But anyway, that's kind of a little bit separate from what you're talking about. We're talking about, because no matter what happens, even if the Russians do attain an ugly victory, which they will in Ukraine, you're still going to have that hostile EU. I think you're right, and there's constantly, and so the danger is not going to go away, unfortunately, because there are going to be constant provocations. Again, you'll have these Banderite crazies running around in Ukraine, supported by intelligence agencies in the West, carrying out assassinations and attacking critical infrastructure in Russia, and then Russian patience, at some point will be exhausted, and they will, retaliate. And then, the war renews, and maybe this time it won't be just, a proxy war, but an all-out war between Russia and NATO. There's a real risk of that. There really is, because these people will not let go.